Chapter 4. All the years of her life. They were closing the drugstore. Alfred Higgins had just taken off his white jacket. He was putting on his coat and getting ready to go home. Sam Carr, who owned the drugstore, was bending down behind the cash register. When Alfred Higgins passed him, he looked up. He said softly, "Just a moment, Alfred. One moment before you go." The quiet way in which Sam Carr spoke made Alfred nervous. Sam Carr usually said, "Good night," sharply, without looking up. In the 6 months he had been working in the drugstore, Alfred had never heard his employer speak softly like that. His heart began to beat so loudly, it was hard for him to get his breath. "What is it, Mr. Carr?" he asked. "Maybe you'd be good enough to take a few things out of your pockets and leave them here before you go," Sam Carr said. "What things? What are you talking about? You have got a compact and a lipstick and at least 2 tubes of toothpaste in your pockets, Alfred." "What do you mean? Do you think I'm crazy?" Alfred asked. His face got red. But Sam Carr stood by the door with his blue eyes shining brightly beneath his glasses. He nodded his head a few times. Then Alfred grew very frightened, and he didn't know what to say. Slowly, he raised his hand and dipped it into his pocket. With his eyes never meeting Sam Carr's eyes, he took out a blue compact and 2 tubes of toothpaste and a lipstick. He laid them out one by one on the counter. "Petty thievery, eh, Alfred?" Sam Carr said. "And maybe you'd be good enough to tell me how long this has been going on. This is the first time I ever took anything. So, now you think you'll tell me a lie? Eh, what kind of sap do I look like, huh? Do you think I don't know what goes on in my own store? I tell you, you have been doing this pretty steady." Ever since Alfred had left school, he had been getting into trouble wherever he worked. He lived at home with his mother and father. His 2 older brothers and his sister were married. Everything would have been all right now if Alfred was only able to keep a job. "I liked you," Sam Carr was saying. "I liked you and trusted you. Now, look what I got to do." Alfred watched with frightened blue eyes. "I don't like to call a cop in point blank," Sam Carr said. "You're a fool, and maybe I should. Call your father and tell him you're a fool. Maybe I should let them know I'm going to have you locked up." "My father's not at home. He's a printer. He works nights," Alfred said. "Who's at home?" "My mother, I guess." "Then we will see what she says." Sam Carr went to the phone and dialed the number. Alfred was not so much ashamed. But there was a deep fear growing in him. "Just a minute," he called out. "You don't need to draw anybody else in. You don't need to tell her." He wanted to sound like a big guy who could look after himself. Yet the old childish hope was in him, the longing that someone at home would come and help him. "Yeah, that's right, he's in trouble," Mr. Carr was saying. "Yeah, your boy works for me. You'd better come down in a hurry." When he finished, Mr. Carr went over to the door and looked out at the street. He watched the people passing in the late summer night. "I will keep my eye out for a cop," was all he said. Alfred knows how his mother would come rushing in. She would rush in with her eyes blazing. Maybe she would be crying. She would push him away when he tried to talk to her. Yet, he longed that she might come before Mr. Carr saw the cop on the beat passing the door. While they waited, and it seemed a long time, they did not speak. At last, They heard someone tapping on the closed door. Mr. Carr turned the latch. "Come in, Mrs. Higgins," he said. He looked hard-faced and stern. Most of the store lights had been turned out, and at first, she did not see Alfred. He was standing in the shadow at the end of the counter. Yet, as soon as she saw him, she did not look the way Alfred thought she would look. She smiled and her blue eyes looked straight ahead. Calmly, she put out her hand to Mr. Carr. She said politely, "I'm Mrs. Higgins. I'm Alfred's mother." Mr. Carr was a bit surprised by her lack of terror. He hardly knew what to say to her. She asked, "Is Alfred in trouble?" "Yes, he is in trouble. He's been taking things from the store. I caught him red-handed. Little things like compacts and toothpaste and lipsticks. Stuff he can sell easily." As she listened, Mrs. Higgins looked at Alfred from time to time. She nodded her head sadly. When Sam Carr had finished, she asked gravely, "Is it so, Alfred?" "Yes." "Why have you been doing it?" "I have been spending money, I guess." "On what?" "Going around with the guys, I guess," Alfred said. Mrs. Higgins put out her hand and touched Sam Carr's arm gently. She spoke as though afraid of disturbing him. "If you would only listen to me before doing anything," she said. She looked away, but in a moment she was smiling gravely again. She said, "What did you intend to do, Mr. Carr?" "I was going to get a cop." "That's what I ought to do." "Yes, I suppose so. It's not for me to say because he is my son. Yet I sometimes think a little good advice is the best thing for a boy of his age." Alfred couldn't understand his mother's calm. If they had been at home and someone had said that he might be arrested, he knew she would be in a rage. She would cry out against him. Yet, now she was standing there with that gentle smile on her face. She was saying, "I wonder if you don't think it would be better just to let him come home with me. He looks like a big fellow, doesn't he? It takes some of them a long time to get any sense." They both stared at Alfred, who looked away. But, even while he was turning away, Alfred was realizing that Mr. Carr had become aware that his mother was really a fine woman. He knew that Sam Carr was puzzled by his mother. It was as if he had expected her to come in and beg him in tears. Instead, without being alarmed, she was large and still, simple and hopeful. There was only the sound of the mother's soft voice in the store. Then, Mr. Carr began to nod his head at her. "Of course, I don't want to be harsh," Mr. Carr was saying. "I will tell you what I will do. I will just fire him and let it go at that. How's that?" He got up and shook hands with Mrs. Higgins, bowing low to her in deep respect. "I will never forget your kindness," she said. "Sorry we had to meet this way," he said. "But I'm glad I got in touch with you. Just wanted to do the right thing, that's all," he said. "It's better to meet like this than never, isn't it?" she said. Suddenly, they clapped hands as if they liked each other, as if they had known each other for a long time. "Good night, Mrs. Higgins." "I'm truly sorry," he said. The mother and the son walked along the street together. The mother was taking long steps. She looked ahead, her face full of worry. Alfred was afraid to speak to her. He was afraid of the silence that was between them. In a little while, going along like that, he became aware of the strength in her. He began to wonder what she was thinking as she stared ahead. Finally, he said loudly, "I'm glad it turned out like that. I certainly won't get into a jam like that again." "Be quiet. Don't speak to me. You have disgraced me again and again," she said bitterly. "That's the last time. That's all I'm saying. Please be good enough to be quiet," she snapped. They kept on their way, looking straight ahead. When they were at home, she made him feel bad again. Without even looking at him, she said, "You're a bad lot. It's one thing after another and always has been. Why do you stand there looking stupid? Go to bed, why don't you?" As he started to go, she said, "Mind, now, not a word about tonight to your father." While Alfred was undressing in his bedroom, he heard his mother moving around the kitchen. She filled the kettle and put it on the stove. She moved a chair. And as he listened, there was no shame in him, just wonder. He admired her strength and her calm. He could still see Sam Carr nodding his head to her. He could hear her talking softly. She certainly was smooth, he thought. Gee, I'd like to tell her she sounded swell. At last, he got up and went along to the kitchen. At the door, he saw his mother slowly pouring herself a cup of tea. He watched her, but he didn't move. Her face was a frightened, broken face. She looked very old. She reached out and lifted the kettle to pour hot water in her cup. Her hand shook and the water splashed on the stove. She was so unlike the woman who had been so sure of herself in the drugstore. This was the way it had been every time he had been in trouble before. This shaking had been in her as she hurried out to the drugstore. He now understood why she had sat alone in the kitchen at the night his young sister insisted that she was getting married. Now, he felt all that his mother had been thinking of as they walked along the street together a little while ago. He knew all the years of her life by the way her hand shook as she raised the cup to her lips. It seemed to him that this was the first time he had ever really seen his mother. At that moment, his youth was over.